It was Christmas Eve in 1998, and the snow fell heavily on the small town of Black Hollow. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional crunch of boots against the frost-covered pavement. Families gathered in their homes, the warm glow of lights and the sound of carols spilling out into the cold night. For the Johnsons, it was a picture-perfect evening. Their modest house was decorated with twinkling lights, and a Christmas tree stood proudly in the corner of the living room, its ornaments shimmering in the firelight. 8-year-old Emily sat by the window, her breath fogging up the glass as she peered outside. "Do you think Santa will come tonight?" she asked, her eyes wide with excitement. Her father chuckled. "Of course, sweetheart. He always does." But deep in the woods, a shadow moved, something that wasn't human. At precisely 11:45 p.m., just as the family was preparing to head to bed, there was a knock at the door. It was soft but deliberate. "Who could that be at this hour?" Mrs. Johnson asked, her voice tinged with concern. Mr. Johnson frowned. "Probably a neighbor needing help with the snow." He opened the door, but no one was there. The snow on the porch was untouched, pristine. A cold gust of wind swept into the house, carrying with it the faint scent of something metallic. "Must have been the wind," Mr. Johnson muttered, closing the door and locking it. But as he turned away, the knock came again, louder this time. Emily clutched her mother's hand. "Daddy, who's there?" "I don't know, sweetheart," he replied, trying to mask his unease. This time, when he opened the door, a figure stood there. It was a man dressed in a tattered Santa suit, his beard yellowed and matted. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were sunken, staring blankly ahead. He didn't speak. "Can I help you?" Mr. Johnson asked cautiously. The man tilted his head slightly, a slow, unnatural movement, and smiled. His teeth were sharp, jagged, and stained red. "I've come for the children," he whispered. Before Mr. Johnson could react, the man lunged forward, his movements impossibly fast. The door slammed shut on its own, trapping the family inside. The lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. Emily screamed as the fire in the hearth sputtered out, leaving only the faint glow of the Christmas tree. The ornaments rattled on their hooks, and the air grew thick with the stench of decay. "Stay behind me!" Mr. Johnson shouted, grabbing a fireplace poker. But the man was gone. "Where did he go?" Mrs. Johnson whispered, her voice trembling. A low, guttural laugh echoed through the house, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I see you," the voice taunted. Suddenly, the tree lights burst into a blinding red glow, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The ornaments began to spin, faster and faster, until they flew off the tree like shrapnel. One of them narrowly missed Emily's head, shattering against the wall. The family huddled together, their breaths coming in short gasps. "What do you want?" Mr. Johnson yelled into the darkness. The laughter stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a single word. "Blood." The sound of heavy boots echoed through the house, growing louder and closer. The family ran upstairs, slamming the bedroom door behind them. Mr. Johnson pushed a dresser in front of the door, his hands shaking. "What is happening?" Mrs. Johnson sobbed, clutching Emily tightly. "I don't know," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. "But we'll get through this." The floorboards creaked outside the door, the handle jiggled. "Let me in," the voice sang, its tone mocking. Emily began to cry, burying her face in her mother's shoulder. The dresser slid across the floor on its own, as if pulled by invisible hands. The door burst open, and there he was, the man in the Santa suit, his eyes glowing a sickly yellow. He stepped into the room, dragging a sack behind him. It writhed as though something alive was inside. "You've been very naughty," he said, grinning. Mr. Johnson swung the fireplace poker, but it passed through the man as if he were made of smoke. The man laughed, his form flickering like a dying flame. "Run!" Mr. Johnson shouted. The family bolted down the hallway, but the house seemed to twist and shift around them. Doors led to nowhere, and the stairs stretched endlessly. The man's laughter followed them, growing louder with each passing second. They finally stumbled into the basement, slamming the door shut behind them. The room was cold, the air damp and heavy. Old Christmas decorations were piled in the corners, their colors faded with age. "What do we do now?" Mrs. Johnson asked, her voice breaking. Mr. Johnson searched the room desperately, his eyes landing on an old iron cross hanging on the wall. He grabbed it, holding it tightly. The door shattered and the man stepped inside. His form had changed. He was taller now, his limbs unnaturally long, his fingers ending in claws. His sack dragged behind him, leaving a trail of blood. "This is my house now," he hissed. Mr. Johnson held the cross in front of him. "Stay back!" The man recoiled, hissing like a wild animal. The cross seemed to burn his flesh, smoke rising from his skin. Emily, still clutching her mother, noticed something in the corner, a small wooden box. It was covered in strange carvings and pulsed faintly with light. "Daddy!" she cried, pointing to the box. Mr. Johnson grabbed it, instinctively opening it. A blinding light filled the room, and the man let out an ear-piercing scream. His form disintegrated, the shadows retreating into the corners of the basement. When the light faded, the family was alone. The house was silent, the air still. They climbed back upstairs, finding everything as it had been before. The Christmas tree stood untouched, the ornaments back in place. But the front door was wide open, and in the snow outside, there were no footprints. The family moved out of Black Hollow shortly after, unable to shake the memory of that night. They never celebrated Christmas again. Years later, Emily, now an adult, returned to the town out of curiosity. The house was abandoned, its windows boarded up. As she stood outside, she noticed something in the snow, a single set of footprints leading to the front door. And from inside, she heard a soft, deliberate knock,